If Terra, the cradle of mankind, the heart of the Imperium, the throne of the master of humanity himself, were ever to fall, then everything we believe about permanence would collapse with it. For 10,000 years, we have told ourselves a comforting lie, that Terra is eternal, that no force born of mortal flesh or alien chitin could ever reach its sacred soil. But even the strongest lie can fracture under the softest whisper. And this story begins with a whisper, faint, distant, and yet heavy enough to bend the fate of a galaxy. On the dawn of the final day, Terra looked as it always had. The spires of the imperial palace stood untouched, stabbing into the polluted sky like monolithic prayers. Oceans of pilgrims continued their slow march across ash-covered plains, the same way generations before them had. Millions toiled in manufactoria that had not rested since the Emperor's Great Crusade. And above it all, the Astronomicon burned like a star in the warp, its holy radiance visible only to psykers, but felt by the entire Imperium as the heartbeat of humanity. Everything was normal, or at least normal by the cruel standards of the 41st millennium. No one expected the end to arrive on such an ordinary morning. No one imagined that the first sign would not be a roar, but a murmur. It began in the void stations scattered across the outer regions of the Sol system. Tech adepts listening to the static sea of interstellar noise detected something out of place. Not a signal, not a code, not a scream of daemons breaking through the warp. It was something biological, a pulse, a rhythm, a whisper made of hunger. Some claimed it sounded like 1,000 hearts beating in unison. Others insisted it resembled the rustling of a forest being devoured by invisible fire. But the most disturbing report came from a junior astropath, who described it simply as a mouth breathing in the dark. The High Lords of Terra received the news in putrid silence. Even among their ranks, beings accustomed to horror, betrayal, and galactic tragedy, something about this whisper unsettled them. It was too cold, too deliberate, too alive. Yet no one dared speak its name. To utter the possibility aloud would make it real, and reality carries consequences the Imperium often fails to survive. For several days, the whispers continued, growing stronger. At first, the Administratum dismissed them as anomalies caused by warp storms or solar interference. But as the signals thickened, threading through Vox channels and psyker networks alike, denial became impossible. Something was approaching Sol. Something vast, coordinated, and impossibly ravenous. Still, Terra continued its routines. Citizens marched to labor, priests chanted their litanies, and soldiers patrolled with mechanical discipline. But beneath the veneer of stability, a subtle unease crept through the population, a kind of tension that lingered in the air, as if every breath carried the taste of coming death. Even the custodes felt it. They, who were crafted to be fearless and unshakable, found themselves pausing beneath the gilded arches of the palace, as if listening for a distant tremor. In their gene-forged instincts, something ancient stirred, the awareness that a predator had entered the periphery of their world. The turning point came when the Astronomicon flickered. It dimmed for less than a second, but that second was enough to send shockwaves across the entire Imperium. Starships thousands of light years away staggered in the warp. Astropaths screamed as visions of impossible shadows filled their minds. Shadows with countless eyes and an appetite that stretched across the stars. On Terra, the flicker was felt as a collective shiver. It was as though the Emperor himself inhaled sharply, sensing the approach of something that threatened even his divine throne. The next hours brought a cascade of revelations. Vox relays on Pluto stopped transmitting. Lunar defense grids went silent. Patrol fleets stationed near the outer edges of the system disappeared, leaving behind nothing but drifting debris and psychic echoes that tasted like blood and acid. In the Strategium, inquisitors whispered to one another, voices hushed as if afraid the walls might hear them. This hive fleet, it is larger than Behemoth, larger than Leviathan, larger than every recorded encounter combined. We are not facing an attack, we are facing consumption. Yet even these dire warnings were spoken behind sealed doors, away from the terrified eyes of the masses. The Imperium has always relied on ignorance as its final shield, but secrets have a way of leaking, especially when the warp itself seems to be trembling. Across Terra, nightmares spread like a contagion. Psykers reported visions of worlds stripped to bone and dust, their atmospheres dissolved, their oceans drained into colossal bioships. In these visions, a single idea dominated: hunger without end. And amidst this rising dread, a final whisper echoed clearer, stronger, unmistakably intentional. A message not sent, but felt. A greeting from the void. A promise. A threat. We are coming. The hive mind had arrived at the edge of Sol System. But Terra, in its arrogance and ancient pride, still tried to believe in its own invincibility. After all, this was the throne world, the holiest of holies, protected by the greatest armies humanity had ever assembled. Surely nothing could breach these walls. Surely no Xenos could defile the home of the Emperor. But deep beneath the cathedral of the Astronomicon, where psykers were sacrificed by the thousands to keep humanity's light burning, the truth was already known. The conduits trembled. The warp grew thick and suffocating, and the Emperor's psychic presence, usually unwavering, cold, and absolute, flickered with an emotion unseen for millennia. Not fear, but recognition. For the first time since the Horus Heresy, something approached Terra that was not merely an enemy, but a force of nature, an extinction given form. And the whisper grew louder. The hive mind did not arrive as a single shape in the dark. It arrived as absence. First, the outermost auger stations in the Sol System reported signal clutter, dense, layered distortions that washed over their auspex like a storm made of whispers. Vox technicians adjusted arrays, recited machine prayers, and bled incense into sacred vents, but the noise only thickened. Then, one by one, the stations stopped reporting anything at all. Official communiques called it ion interference. Unofficially, the word Tyranid began to circulate in the lower decks of void ships and in the quiet chambers of the Inquisition. Those who spoke it out loud did so as if naming a curse. In the strategium aboard the Solar Fleet's command bastion, holoprojectors traced the lines of disappearing patrol routes across a three-dimensional map of the Sol System. Red icons representing picket ships winked out, not in a dramatic explosion or heroic last stand, but in eerie silence. One heartbeat they were there, dutifully patrolling the void. The next, they were gone, leaving behind no distress signals, no recorded data, only an expanding corona of static, admirals argued. Some urged immediate redeployment, a tightening of the defensive cordon around the core planets. Others demanded counter-offensives, insisting that to yield the outer system was to invite panic. But beneath the ritualized bravado and the liturgical bark of orders, they all sensed the same thing. This was not a conventional invasion. This was something that did not simply enter a system. It occupied it in ways no human mind was meant to understand. Reports from the remaining listening posts painted a crude, horrifying picture. They spoke of objects moving at impossible speeds, not in clear formations like an Imperial battle group, but in living currents. Bioships the size of small moons, drifting like predatory whales through a black ocean. Smaller, faster organisms swarmed like schools of piranhas, tearing apart everything in their path from debris fields to entire escort flotillas. Some of the tech priests spoke of comets of flesh and asteroids made of bone and sinew. Their descriptions were quietly redacted from official records, but not before a few stray lines escaped into the rumor networks that permeated the Void crews. Men and women who had spent their lives in the dead silence between worlds began to fear the darkness itself. And then came the visions. Astropaths across the Sol System began to convulse in unison, racked by waves of psychic feedback that hit them like invisible detonations. Many died instantly, their minds crushed by an alien presence that did not even notice them. Those who survived spoke in fragmented, trembling phrases of an ocean made of teeth, of a sky that pulsed like a beating organ, of a consciousness so vast that it did not recognize individuals, only biomass. The Inquisition listened. In hidden vaults carved deep beneath Terra's ancient crust, inquisitors of the Ordo Xenos gathered around hollow sigils displaying the last transmissions of dying astropaths. Their faces were lit by the cold glow of data screens and the ember light of devotional braziers. They saw patterns in the madness, a terrible consistency in the descriptions. This was no stray splinter fleet, no wounded shard left behind from Leviathan or Kraken. This was a storm in full. This hive fleet, one inquisitor murmured, voice hoarse, almost reverent in its dread, is larger than any we have recorded, larger than any we have survived. Another, older than the rest and bearing the scars of too many campaigns, added quietly, "This is not a raid, not a testing of defenses. This is appetite. Focused. Perfect." They sent their findings to the High Lords in sealed data coffins, wrapped in blessings and wards. They knew that even if their warnings were heeded, there might already be too little time. The hive mind moved with a kind of patient inevitability. It did not rush, it did not hesitate, it advanced like hunger itself. Beyond Neptune, the first visual confirmations came in from a doomed recon flotilla that had ventured further than any wise man would. Their picked feeds were damaged, partially corrupted by psychic interference and bioplasma flares, but what remained was enough. The background stars were gone. In their place was a wall, not of stone or metal, but of organic colossi, joined together by tendrils of living matter that pulsed like veins. Enormous, pulsating sacs excreted clouds of spores that spread through the void like ink in water. Between these titanic forms darted smaller creatures, spined, jagged silhouettes that emitted lances of corrosive energy, or simply hurled themselves bodily at Imperial vessels, tearing through hulls with mindless ferocity. To the human eye, it looked less like a fleet and more like a migrating ecosystem, an entire biosphere uprooted from its native galaxy and set loose upon this one. The last broadcast from the recon flotilla did not contain tactical analysis or formal reporting. It contained the voice of a single Vox officer, sobbing as he whispered, "It's not ships. It's not ships at all. It's a living sky." The transmission ended with a shriek of tearing metal and a rising roar that was not sound but raw psychic pressure, captured briefly by the vessel's sensors before they failed. It was like listening to a million throats screaming in perfect unison, not in pain, but in triumph. In the days that followed, the Sol system shrank. Not in physical size, of course, but in usable space. Regions that had once been traversed freely by patrols and merchant vessels became opaque with Tyranid bioplasma and chitinous debris. Trade routes and approach vectors were swallowed by growing dead zones, where no signal could pass, where no Imperial craft returned. To the people of Terra, life remained outwardly unchanged at first. The ecclesiarchy continued its rituals, the administratum continued its endless calculations, and the planetary defense networks tracked their usual catalogue of debris, civilian traffic, and sanctioned military movements. Yet an unspoken tension spread through the hive cities and temple complexes like a cold draft through ancient halls. Pilgrims reported uneasy dreams of stars going out one by one, of cathedrals built from bone instead of stone. In the Schola Progenium, orphaned children trained to become tomorrow's officers, and commissars awoke screaming in the night, claiming they had seen the sky breaking. Even the servitors, mindless as they were, glitched more frequently, their rote prayers to the Omnissiah stuttering as stray psychic interference grazed their implanted circuitry. Above it all, the Astronomicon struggled. Its light was still there, but now it flickered in ways that no one could fully explain. Astropaths, attempting to use it as a beacon, reported resistance, as if the warp itself were thickening, congealing around the Sol system like a cocoon of psychic pressure. The more sensitive among them swore that they could feel something pushing against that light, like a tide lapping at the base of a lighthouse, patient and relentless. Each wave was made not of water, but of thought, alien thought, hungry thought. On the bridge of the flagship of the Solar Fleet, the Lord Admiral looked out upon the void, displayed in all its false clarity on the grand viewing screens. The Tyranids were still beyond long-range weapon range, but already their presence warped the readings. Energy signatures bled into each other, distances seemed to wobble, as if space itself were unsettled. He asked one of his senior Augur officers, "What are we looking at, exactly?" The officer, a veteran of many campaigns, but never one like this, swallowed hard before answering. "Not an enemy formation, my lord," he said softly. "An ecology." That word ecology hung in the air like sacrilege. An enemy could be fought, an army could be broken, a fleet could be shattered. But how do you fight an ecology? How do you battle something that does not recognize the concept of defeat because it does not understand itself as separate pieces that can be lost? The hive mind did not care how many organisms died in its name. They were not soldiers to it, they were cells. And cells are meant to be expended. As the swarm drew nearer, a strange paradox settled over Terra and the Sol system. On one hand, the threat had never been clearer. The Auspex readings, the psychic screams, the disappearance of entire flotillas, all of it pointed to a single, inevitable conclusion. The Tyranids were coming. On the other hand, there was a growing sense of surreal detachment. The scale of the approaching catastrophe was so great that the human mind could not truly internalize it. It became a story, an abstraction, something that existed in reports and strategic projections rather than in the hearts of the people. But the warp knew. The warp always knows. Every surge of fear, every whispered prayer, every unspoken dread bled into that churning sea of unreality, and the Tyranids tasted it, not as emotion, not as meaning, but as information, a map of terror leading them straight to the brightest, loudest beacon of human existence. Terror. The heart of the Imperium beat on, unaware that a devouring mouth was opening around it, teeth closing slowly, inexorably, with the patience of a predator that has never once known hunger go unsatisfied. When the Tyranids finally crossed the invisible threshold between the outer Sol system and the Imperial heartland, Terra responded, as it always had, with ritual, doctrine, and the illusion of control. The Imperium had weathered 10,000 years of war, betrayal, and cosmic catastrophe. It had buried gods, slain primarchs, and survived the birth screams of the cicatrix maledictum. Surely, it would survive this. That was the assumption. The lie. And it began to unravel the moment the first void black shadow fell upon the outer edges of Mars' defense grid. High above Terra, Fleet Solar moved into formation, a glittering halo of battleships, strike cruisers, frigates, defense monitors, and orbital bastions. They stood shoulder to shoulder, like iron phalanxes of the Legiones Astartes from ages long past. These were ships forged over centuries, sanctified by tech priests, blessed by confessors, fueled by the dying dreams of billions. Each vessel was a cathedral of war, bristling with macro cannons, plasma batteries, lance arrays, and entire choirs of astropaths singing navigation hymns. Yet even as these leviathans aligned themselves, there was an unmistakable tension in the air, a heaviness, like the last breath held before drowning. The Custodes felt it first. Standing upon the golden terraces of the Imperial Palace, their auramite armor gleaming beneath a pallid sun, the 10,000 watched the horizon as if expecting it to split open. Their psychic instincts, honed from birth, sharpened by centuries of battle, sensed a disturbance deeper than any mortal augur array could detect. It was not merely danger, it was inevitability, a pull in the fabric of reality, dragging all things toward a single, catastrophic point. Not far from them, in the depths of the Sanctum Imperialis, the Grey Knights performed rites older than the Imperium itself. Their voices echoed through marble corridors, engraved with the names of demons defeated across 1,000,000 worlds. They did not expect to survive the coming battle, but survival was never their purpose. Their purpose was to buy time. Time, the only currency left. Across Terra, the Imperial fists raised their fortifications, as they had since the Great Crusade. Static lines crackled, shield generators hummed to life. The walls of the Imperial Palace, once breached only by Horus himself, activated their multi-layered defense fields. Even the common citizens felt a shift. The air tasted metallic, charged with an electric dread. Sirens wailed across hive blocks. Cathedrals filled beyond capacity, devotees pressing against one another, chanting prayers older than memory. On the Ecclesiarchy's Vox networks, a single message played endlessly. Remain calm, trust in the Emperor. Terror shall not fall. But fear does not obey orders. And hope cannot replace firepower. In the void, the first engagement began. It was subtle at first, a shimmer in the darkness, a warping of light, as if space itself was bending under a colossal weight. Sensors screamed warnings. Lance batteries fired reflexively, streaking beams of light into the abyss. For a moment, nothing responded. Then the void answered. Thousands of Tyranid organisms surged into view at once, not decloaking, not emerging from the warp, but simply revealing themselves as the tendrils of the hive mind relaxed. They flew in patterns that no human commander could decipher. Spirals, waves, clustered knots of chitin and flesh. No two creatures were the same, yet all were connected by threads of psychic command. The first volley from Fleet Solar struck them like a storm of light. Macro shells detonated. Plasma burned through chitin. Lance strikes carved lines of molten biomass through their ranks. Yet the swarm did not break. It did not falter. It simply filled the gaps with more bodies. The Lord Admiral ordered full bombardment. Battleships unleashed salvos that could shatter continents. Orbital fortresses fired weapons that had lain dormant since the heresy. The void lit up like a second sun. Still the swarm came. For every Tyranid creature that died, 10 more surged forward, propelled not by strategy or courage but by instinct engineered over eons, the instinct to feed. The first Imperial ship to fall was the valiant Requiem, a grand cruiser older than many Imperial worlds. A cluster of bioplasma bolts tore through her prow, splintering adamantium like wet parchment. She did not explode. She simply folded inward, collapsing as Tyranid organisms burrowed through her fractured hull. Her death cry, a flood of vox screams and binary prayers, echoed across the fleet. More ships followed. The Indomitus Gloria lost her engines to a living torpedo that adhered like a leech and burned through 6 decks. The Sword of Piety broke apart when a colossal hive beast rammed her broadside. Dozens of escort ships were torn into pieces by smaller organisms that latched on like ticks, draining power and chewing through hull steel with acid-dripping mandibles. The battle was no longer a strategic engagement. It was dismemberment. On Terra, tremors shook the hives as orbital defense lasers fired upward in continuous volleys. Towering cannons, each taller than a cathedral, spat beams of blinding energy into the sky. Their light lanced through the upper atmosphere, striking Tyranid organisms that had breached the void and descended toward the cradle of mankind. But even these weapons, the pride of Terra's centuries of preparation, could not fire fast enough. Citizens gathered in open plazas, staring upward. Those with augmetic eyes saw the truth first. The sky was dimming, not from smoke or clouds, but from shadows, serpentine and vast, moving beneath the sunlight. A terrified preacher pointed upward, shouting, "The sky bleeds, the sky bleeds." And indeed, it did. Chitinous forms blotted out the sun, dripping strands of biomatter that smoked upon contact with air. Winged Tyranids shrieked, their psychic voices clawing at mortal minds. Children cried. Adults dropped to their knees. Some clawed at their own faces, overwhelmed by the psychic smell of extinction. The Tyranids had breached Terra's skies. Deep beneath the Imperial Palace, alarms that had not sounded since the days of dawn and the heresy blared with shrill finality. Custodes sprinted through hallways of gold and obsidian. Their perfect discipline, their absolute calm, cracked only slightly a twitch of the jaw, a tightening of gauntlets, a brief, silent curse. To fear nothing is the creed of the 10,000, but even they felt the weight of inevitability. On the command platform, surrounded by stratageum displays flickering with static, the Lord Admiral whispered to himself not a prayer, not a curse, but a simple acknowledgement of reality. There is no strategy for this. For the swarm was not attacking, it was arriving. And Terra, for all its walls, its armies, its faith, was not prepared for arrival. By the time the 3rd hour of battle ended, Fleet Solar was no longer a fleet, it was a graveyard. Wreckage drifted in, slowly growing rings around Terra, forming a ghastly halo of twisted metal and frozen corpses. But the dead did not matter. Not to the hive mind. The biomass did, and so the swarm descended deeper, hungrier, more certain. Terra trembled, and the defense, the proud, ancient, unbreakable defense of humanity's cradle, began to fracture under the truth no one wanted to face. You cannot defend a world against a force that does not understand defeat. There are moments in history when time itself seems to fracture, when centuries of faith, industry, sacrifice, and dominion collapse into a handful of ticking seconds. Terra, the throne world, the beating heart of humanity, had endured 10,000 years of siege, rebellion, demonic incursion, and Xenos predation. Yet all of that legacy unraveled in half a day. 12 hours. 12 hours for the cradle of mankind to be emptied, devoured, and hollowed. It began with the first hour, the hour of impact. Hour 1, when the sky split open. At 6:02 Terran Standard, the first of the hive beasts breached Terra's upper atmosphere. They fell not like meteors but like embryonic gods, wrapped in veils of bioplasma and trailing strands of sizzling genetic residue. Their bodies were colossal, some spanning kilometers, their silhouettes writhing as hundreds of tendrils whipped beneath them like the arms of a drowning leviathan. Orbital defense cannons fired continuously, their beams carving molten trenches across the sky. Dozens of Tyranid organisms were incinerated mid-descent, their bodies bursting into clouds of spores and acidic mist. But the rest kept coming. From the eastern horizon, a living shadow rose, a swarm so vast it resembled a continent made of wings and teeth. The people of Terra looked up and saw the sun dim. Children in the underhive screamed as daylight turned a sickly violet. Pilgrims on the roads to the Imperial Palace fell to their knees, clutching holy icons tight enough to draw blood. Even the most hardened soldiers in the planetary defense regiments hesitated, rifles trembling. The thought echoed across Terra like a subconscious cry. This cannot be real. But reality does not wait for belief. The first bio-titans landed near the Pan-Pacific trenches, crushing fortifications beneath their mass. Their roars shook the ground. They did not roar from anger or pain, they roared like engines, announcing the start of consumption. The first hour ended in a storm of falling chitin. Hour 3, the cities die. By the third hour, the Tyranids had reached Terra's megacities. The assault was methodical, almost ritualistic. Smaller creatures, gaunts, gargoyles, ripper swarms flooded the streets in waves so dense they resembled rivers of flesh. Doors were broken down. Hab blocks were punctured as if made of wax. Millions of civilians fled into cathedrals, only to discover that sacred walls provided no shelter from a predator that did not recognize sanctity. Screams blended with the thunder of bolters. Imperial fists fired from yellow bastions that had stood for millennia, but their volleys were swallowed by the swarm. Servitors overloaded their plasma coils, exploding in last-ditch attempts to burn the tide. The Adeptus Arbites unleashed shock mauls and suppression fire, only to be drowned in bodies moments later. In Hive Helios, a titan of the Legio Ignatum Bellator Ferrum waded into the streets, each step crushing hundreds of alien organisms. Its volcano cannon fired once, twice, 3 times, turning entire blocks into molten glass. The princeps screamed litanies of wrath and defiance as the machine god poured red-hot vengeance upon the swarm. But for every Tyranid killed, 100 more surged forward. Bioplasma struck the titan's legs. Acid burrowed into adamantium. Thousands of small creatures climbed its plating, gnawing through armor that had survived the Horus heresy. Within 20 minutes, Bellator Ferrum toppled. As it fell, the hive city died with it. Hour 6, the world is cocooned. At the 6th hour, Terra itself began to change. The swarm no longer fought simply to kill, it fought to harvest. Enormous tendrils from the descending hive beasts pierced the soil like roots. These tendrils pulsed, contracting rhythmically as they sucked nutrients, minerals, water, and biological matter directly into the sky. Seas began to boil. Forests withered in minutes. Mountains sagged as their inner structure was hollowed out. The Mechanicus attempted to launch counterattacks from their redoubts beneath Olympus Mons, but the moment their war machines emerged, they were blinded by clouds of spore-choked wind. Mycetic spores rained down in sheets. Pods cracked open, releasing creatures designed for a single purpose: to burrow, to break, to corrupt. A tech priest Magos broadcast a final transmission before his Vox array dissolved. The world is being hollowed. It is becoming food. His voice dissolved into wet static as a feeder beast wrapped around him, draining the life from his body. By hour 6, Terra was no longer a world. It was becoming a carcass. Hour 9, the last walls fall. As the 9th hour ended, the swarm reached the Imperial Palace. The Custodes fought with the fury of demigods. Their guardian spears flashed like shards of captured sunlight. Dozens of Tyranids died with every swing, but even gods bleed when drowned in enough teeth. The palace walls shook as bio-titans hurled their mass against them. Massive biocannons fired globs of corrosive matter the size of manufactoria blocks. Golden spires collapsed under the weight of winged monstrosities that smashed through them like knives through parchment. Inside the sanctum, grey knights enacted their final rites. Their voices rose in perfect, disciplined unity. We stand between the shadow and the light. But the shadow was endless, and the light was fading. One by one, their psychic wards shattered. Librarians' minds burst as the hive mind pressed down upon their thoughts with overwhelming force. Their silver armor cracked beneath claws, engineered to rend through ceramite and flesh alike. By hour 9, the Grey Knights were gone. Their sacrifices bought minutes. Nothing more. Hour 11, the silence before the end. In the 11th hour, terror entered a kind of stillness. Not peace, not calm. A stillness born of exhaustion, the brief quiet before a predator finishes its meal. Astronomican's light flickered violently. Psykers across the globe screamed and died. A ring of dead, hollowed-out bodies formed around the golden throne, their minds ripped open like discarded fruit husks. Even the Emperor's psychic aura, ancient, immutable, pulsed erratically, like a candle fighting the wind. The sky was no longer a sky. It was a membrane of living creatures, shifting and pulsing, completely blotting out the sun. Under that unnatural twilight, the last remnants of Terra's armies continued fighting. Sisters of battle ignited themselves with holy promethium, flinging burning bodies into the swarm. Veterans of countless crusades dragged wounded comrades behind collapsing shrines. Planetary defense troopers shouted prayers as their rifles overheated and melted in their hands. But by this hour, everyone knew. There was no victory to be found. Only defiance. Hour 12, Terra is no more. At 18:02, Terran Standard, exactly 12 hours after first contact, Terra ceased to exist as a living world. The hive mind tightened its tendrils. The crust broke. Continents sagged inward. The last oceans vaporized. Everything, stone, steel, flesh, bone, flowed upward in great streams, funneled into the waiting maws of the hive beasts encircling the globe. Terra's atmosphere collapsed in a single, catastrophic implosion. Where once stood the throne world, there now hung a sphere of pulsing bioresidue, a drained husk wrapped in organic scaffolds. The Emperor's light began to dim, not extinguished, not yet, but flickering, weakening, dying. 12 hours. That was all it took for the Imperium's greatest world to be devoured. Not conquered, not captured, not destroyed, consumed. In the aftermath of Terra's consumption, the galaxy did not erupt into chaos all at once. Instead, it held its breath. For a single, fragile moment, across billions of worlds, there was silence, a silence born not of peace, but of the vast, incomprehensible shock rippling through reality itself. Terra had fallen, not in a glorious siege, not in a last stand worthy of saga or scripture, but in a quiet, crushing inevitability, as if the universe itself had always known this was how it would end. Yet while the world was already lost, there were still warriors fighting upon its corpse. The Custodes' gold before the eclipse. Deep within the skeletal remains of the imperial palace, amidst dust clouds made from ground stone and the shredded remains of marble halls, the Adeptus Custodes stood for the last time. They did not retreat. They did not scatter. They did not mourn. Custodians are not taught to die well. They are taught not to die at all. Yet even they understood, in the fractured light filtering through a sky now made of flesh and chitin, that their purpose had shifted. No longer protectors of a living emperor, no longer sentinels of a sacred world. They had become monuments to a dying age. 300 of them formed a circle around the ruins of the Sanctum Imperialis, golden armor tarnished with acidic burns. Their guardian spears hummed with unstable power. What remained of their helms reflected a sky writhing with Tyranid tendrils. One custodian, his voice quiet yet resonant, whispered, "We are all that stands between remembrance and oblivion." Another replied, "Then let us be remembered for our last hour." When the next wave came, tens of thousands of Tyranid creatures spilling down broken corridors and over melted battlements, the Custodes charged. Each swing of their spears carved arcs of golden fire. Each thrust turned dozens of enemies to shredded biomass. Their war cries echoed like thunder trapped inside a tomb. For a brief, impossible moment, they held. Then the sky cracked open. A bio-titan descended, and the golden circle was swallowed. Their deaths were not witnessed, but their stand echoed for a heartbeat in the warp itself. The sisters of battle flames in the darkness, far from the throne room, in a shattered basilica whose stained glass windows had dissolved into liquefied color, the sisters of battle enacted their final rite. Led by Canoness Astrea, their armor cracked, their robes torn and smoking, they formed a living cross amidst piles of Tyranid corpses. Hymns vibrated across the desecrated chapel, not hopeful, not pleading, but furious, defiant, a litany of denial hurled into the devouring maw descending from the heavens. Holy Emperor, let our deaths be fire. The canoness raised her brazier high. The sacred flame within it flickered under the pressure of alien winds, then flared in sudden brilliance as she poured the last reserves of holy promethium into the bowl. The sisters lit themselves. Their bodies became pyres. Their screams became prayers. Their sacrifice became a brief, incandescent wound in the swarm. The Tyranids recoiled as the blaze erupted outward, a supernova of faith and chemical fire that incinerated whole broods instantly. Even the hive beasts paused, confused by the ferocity of a species willing to burn its own flesh to deny them sustenance. But fire, too, must fade. As the flames died down, the sisters collapsed, armor fused to bone, hands still gripping their weapons. A final whisper escaped from the burning lips of Canoness Astrea. "We die a light." Moments later, the swarm retook the basilica, and the sacred fire was extinguished forever. The Grey Knight's litanies against the inevitable. In the catacombs beneath the palace chambers, carved from black stone and protected by wards etched with the blood of psykers, the last surviving Grey Knights gathered. 40 remained, all exhausted, all bleeding, all aware of what must be done. Their librarian, his armor cracked and luminous with psychic fractures, addressed them with a voice that trembled not from fear, but from strain. "We cannot win. We can only delay." The ritual began. They drew sigils of banishment in the air, each one burning with psychic fire. They recited the rite of anti-consumption, a forbidden litany meant to poison the psychic currents the Tyranids fed upon. It was a technique used only twice in recorded history, both times ending in the complete annihilation of the psykers performing it. The hive mind pressed against their barrier like a tidal wave of will. Thoughts not meant for human minds boiled into their skulls, images of worlds stripped to their planetary cores, of stars dimmed by clouds of spores, of galaxies passed not by light or distance, but by nutritional yield. The Grey Knights screamed, not in pain, but in understanding. They saw the universe as the Tyranids did a harvest without end. Then they detonated. Psychic energy burst from their bodies, vaporizing the catacombs and sending a shockwave rippling across Terra's corpse. For 40 precious seconds, the hive mind hesitated. 40 seconds gained, 40 Grey Knights gone. A fair exchange, by Imperium standards. The psykers, the shattered lantern. While warriors bled in the ruined corridors of Terra, the true catastrophe unfolded upon the quantum choirs of the Astronomicon. Thousands of psykers, once chained in elaborate sacrificial arcs to maintain the Emperor's beacon, now convulsed violently. Their minds, once fortified by the strongest wards in the Imperium, were torn open by the sheer psychic pressure of the hive mind's proximity. One by one, they died. Not quietly. Their souls detonated like fragile lanterns under the heel of an approaching giant, their psychic residue scattering into the warp like the ashes of burned manuscripts. The cathedral of the Astronomicon flickered. Lights dimmed, brass machinery screeched as it attempted to compensate. A lone choir mistress, her eyes melting into streams of silver fluid, uttered a final report through a vox throat scorched by warp fire. The light cannot bear the weight. Her body collapsed into ash before her last word finished transmitting. The Astronomicon's glow stuttered, then dimmed, then flickered. Like a dying star, like a candle in a storm, the Emperor's shadow. Deep within the throne room, where the Emperor's skeletal form sat immobile upon the golden throne, the air itself seemed to whimper. The Custodes had fallen. The Sisters had burned. The Grey Knights had died in ritual sacrifice. The psykers had been drained, shattered, consumed. Now only silence remained. Silence and the slow, weakening pulse of a dying god. For the first time in 10 millennia, the Emperor's light faltered. The psychic beacon that had held the Imperium together dimmed until it resembled not a sun, but a fading ember. Somewhere in the warp, daemons screamed in triumph. Somewhere in the void, the Tyranids shuddered in delight. And somewhere across the galaxy, billions of humans felt a pressure in their chest, as if something beloved, something essential had just been torn away. A custodian's severed helm lay at the foot of the throne. A single gold feather drifted down, its luster dulled by ash. Terror was gone. But this was the moment the Imperium truly died. Not when the world was consumed, but when hope was. When terror fell, the galaxy did not explode. It unraveled. There was no single, shattering moment where everything ended in a blaze of revelation. Instead, the Imperium began to bleed out slowly, unevenly, from a million wounds at once. Like a colossus stabbed not in the chest, but in every limb, every organ, every vein. The loss of Terra was the killing blow, but it took time for the rest of the body to realize it was dead. The first sign was the light. Or rather, its absence. The day the stars went blind. For 10,000 years, the Astronomicon had been the Imperium's guiding star, an artificial sun burning in the warp, allowing navigators to steer ships through madness with something resembling direction. No captain had ever seen it with mortal eyes, but all had depended on it. When Terra was consumed, the Astronomicon flickered, dimmed, and then shrank to a frail, shivering ember. Across the galaxy, in a billion-strong scatter of void ships, navigators screamed. Many tore out their own eyes in madness. Their warp gazes filled not with the familiar pillar of golden light, but with shifting darkness. The warp, that endless, roiling ocean of thought and nightmare, surged inward to fill the void left by the Emperor's failing beacon. Some ships were lost instantly. One moment, they sped through the immaterial like arrows aimed at distant stars. The next, they were swallowed by storms of raw emotion, hatred, panic, hunger erupting in tidal waves. Hulls buckled, Geller fields failed, daemons poured through splitting bulkheads like fire through dry cloth. Other ships survived, but stranded. Without the Astronomicon's light, the warp became a labyrinth without a center. Journeys that once took weeks, now took decades if they were possible at all. Entire sectors went dark, not because they were destroyed, but because no message, no ship, no plea for help could cross the new, widening distances. The Imperium had always been vast, fragmented, barely held together by faith and force. Now, it ceased to be a single entity. It became a scattering, sectors in the dark. On some worlds, the change was not noticed immediately. Hive planets continued to grind their populations into labor and ash. Forge worlds continued to produce tanks, titans, and munitions for wars they no longer fully understood. Agri-worlds harvested crops that would never reach their intended destinations. Administratum clerks still stamped edicts bearing the sigil of terror, unaware that the world they served no longer existed as anything but biomass in a Tyranid gut. But slowly, the cracks widened. Shipments stopped arriving. Tithes were not collected. Astropathic choirs strained their voices, trying to send messages toward a throne that no longer answered. Inquisitors vanished between the stars, their ships lost in incomplete jumps. Entire frontier sectors realized, with a creeping, nauseating dread, that they were alone. Some imperial commanders tried to maintain order. They declared local martial law. They erected statues of the emperor taller than ever, as if height could compensate for distance. They reassured their populations that terror was merely disturbed, that contact would be re-established soon. They lied, not out of malice, out of necessity. For in the dark, other things were stirring. When the predators smelled blood, the galaxy had never been kind. But a galaxy with a dying Imperium became something worse, an open wound in a sea of predators. The orcs were the first to rejoice. Banners multiplied like infections. On worlds once barely holding feral greenskin tribes at bay, The sudden lack of Imperial reinforcements turned small uprisings into planetary avalanches. Orc warbosses, sensing the psychic taste of a failing empire, rallied millions under crude banners, each promising the same thing in different, blood-spattered glyphs. Biggest fight yet. Imperial Guard regiments stranded on the frontiers vanished under tides of green and iron. Astra Militarum command structures collapsed as commanders realized that the map they once referenced, the vast, reassuring sprawl of known sectors and supply lines, no longer meant what it used to. The galaxy had not changed in shape, but in meaning. Far from the frontiers, in the cold, silent tomb worlds, the Necrons awoke. For millennia they had slumbered, rising only in fragments, in isolated episodes of mechanized horror. Now, the combined psychic scream of a dying Imperium echoed through their stasis crypts like a signal flare. One by one, tomb complexes powered up. Pylons hummed with anti-warp resonance. Silent kings and lesser overlords studied data schemes that showed a familiar pattern. A dominant civilization, overextended, weakening, ripe for excision. The Necrons had seen this before, in a different age, under different stars. They had killed gods once. What was a failing empire to them? The rise of the Chaos frontiers. In the eye of terror and the scars of the cicatrix maledictum, Chaos laughed. For 10,000 years, the gods of the warp had gnawed at the edges of the Imperium's reality, throwing cults, warbands, possessed psykers, and daemon incursions at its fortified bastions. They had always been opposed by an obstinate constant. The Emperor's light, faint but stubborn, a golden nail hammered through the skull of the galaxy. That nail was loosening. On demon worlds, skies split with ecstatic screams. The four watched. Khorne shuddered with anticipation at the wars to come. Nurgle hummed contentedly at the thought of stagnation, rot, and despair spreading unchecked. Slaanesh smiled at the coming orgies of excess born from collapsing order. Tzientch's laughter sounded like shattered glass rearranging itself because this, more than anything, was change. Chaos warbands, long trapped in eddies of warped time, found pathways opening. Worlds that had once been too closely protected or too firmly linked to terror now drifted astray, vulnerable, ripe for corruption. On some planets, Imperial governors turned to desperate measures. They made pacts, not with the Imperium, which felt distant and abstract, but with the voices whispering in their dreams, voices that offered survival, power, certainty, at a cost they could worry about later. Civil wars erupted. Faith splintered. Some still clung to the Imperial creed, insisting that terror's silence was a test. Others broke away, declaring new creeds, new interpretations of the Emperor's will. A few went further, declaring the Emperor dead and themselves his inheritors. Chaos did not need to conquer these worlds. It only needed to encourage humanity as prey. Without terror as a beacon, humanity lost more than just a capital. It lost its illusion of centrality. For all its brutality, ignorance, and superstition, the Imperium had always believed one thing, that it was the axis around which history turned. Every war, every crusade, every rebellion, all of it understood in relation to terror, the throne, the Emperor. But a galaxy without terror did not stop turning. It simply no longer had a center. On distant frontier worlds, human settlements became isolated islands in an increasingly hostile ocean. Alien empires, those still slumbering, those long watching, those only now emerging, treated humanity not as conquerors, not even as rivals, but as prey. In the wake of the Tyranid feeding, splinter tendrils of the great devouring fleets sought new biomass-rich regions. Without Imperial patrols and coordinated defenses, many agri-worlds became easy targets. Worlds that had fed 100 systems now fed a single, ever-hungry mouth. In some sectors, humans adapted. They abandoned the pretense of empire and reverted to something older, smaller fortress states, void fortresses, rogue trader dynasties turned into petty kingships. They carved out pockets of survivable reality and hardened them, accepting that help would not come and that the galaxy did not care whether they lived or died. They expanded old mottos into new creeds. The Emperor protects became, the Emperor protects. If we protect ourselves first, Others were not so fortunate. Whole systems vanished, not with a scream, but with a silence. The corpse that still walks. And yet, for all of this, something strange remained true. The Imperium did not stop. Not entirely. On some hololithic star charts, Terra still shone as the designated capital. Administratum offices still stamped its sigil onto decrees. Chaplains still thundered sermons about the throne as if it remained intact. For many far-flung worlds, the idea of Terra mattered more than the reality of it. In this way, the Imperium became something grotesque. A corpse that still walks. A dead empire whose limbs continue to move out of habit and momentum. Decrees are carried out long after the authority that wrote them has been devoured. Wars are fought in the Emperor's name long after his last. Weak pulse has faded beneath the Tyranid feast. Tithes are demanded for wars that will never be coordinated. Ships are built for fleets that no longer exist. From a distance, from the perspective of an Orc warboss, or a Necron overlord, or a Tyranid synapse creature, humanity is still dangerous, still stubborn, still loud. Up close, though, it is fractured, suspicious of itself, bleeding, but too proud to admit the wound, and above all, tragically slow to understand one simple truth. When Terra was eaten, the Imperium did not merely lose its capital. It lost its place in the story. The galaxy is full of hungers, and with its heart gone, humanity is no longer the one writing the tale. It is something else now, something far more fragile, something every predator mistakes for food. When Terra was consumed, the galaxy did not end. It simply changed authors. For 10 millennia, humanity told itself the same story, that it was the protagonist of the stars, the heir to destiny, the chosen species of a god that sat upon a golden throne. Everything, every war, every crusade, every atrocity was framed as part of a singular struggle for human survival and supremacy. But once the throne world was devoured, that illusion died with it. The galaxy did not mourn Terra. The stars did not flicker in remembrance. The void did not whisper eulogies. No cosmic choir sang a lament. Instead, there was only motion, the steady advance of hunger, the quiet rearrangement of power, the beginning of a new epoch written not in imperial ink, but in Tyranid biomass. The Imperium had been the axis of history. Now the galaxy turned for something else. Something older. Something simpler. Something infinitely more honest. Consumption. The Hive Mind's new throne. Far above the remains of Terra, now a hollow sphere wrapped in tendrils of living scaffolds, the Hive Mind recoiled its synaptic reach, folding its awareness inward like a vast, flexing muscle. Billions of organisms died in the battle. Billions more were birthed in its wake. Every death fed a data stream of sensory experience. Every corpse absorbed into digestion pools became a message. Every drop of biomass recovered wove itself into the greater tapestry of the swarm's intelligence. It did not think, as mortals understand thought. It did not reflect. It did not ponder. It knew. It knew terror. It knew humanity. It knew the limitations of flesh, faith, and fire. But more importantly, it knew this. Humanity had lost the ability to resist. Terror had been a symbol, yes, but also a linchpin in the psychic architecture of the galaxy. Without it, humanity's empire had no gravitational center. Its defenses were fragmented, its responses asynchronous, its will diluted. The Hive Mind processed this realization not with triumph, but with precision. Triumph implies ego. Precision is simply what an apex predator does when it tastes blood. Its tendrils spread further into the warp, not boldly, not recklessly, but with steady purpose. The death echo of terror created a psychic vacuum, and into that vacuum the Tyranid presence flowed like cold water into a cracked hull. A new map unfurled before the Hive Mind. A map of worlds, categorized not by allegiance or culture, but by nutritional density. It had fed on a god's cradle. Now it hungered for the rest. A galaxy without a center. Without terror, every world became its own isolated island. In Segmentum Solar, surviving fleets attempted to regroup, only to find their navigators crippled by the dimming Astronomicon. Some ships wandered like ghosts between star systems, their captains reciting the same prayer in increasingly hollow tones. The Emperor protects. But even prayers lose meaning when the god they invoke has grown silent. In Segmentum Pacificus, petty warlords rose from the ashes of Astra Militarum command structures. These men, whose ambitions had once been shackled by oaths to terror, now carved empires from whichever neighboring worlds they could tyrannize. They called themselves protectors, regents, heirs, each title more desperate than the last. In Segmentum Tempestus, the Mechanicus factions debated coldly. Without Terra's authority, the galaxy had become a manufacturing frontier. Forge worlds began hoarding their own output, severing ties, and declaring autonomy. Some even made the unthinkable declaration, "We no longer serve the Emperor. We serve the machine god alone." Faith splintered. Order dissolved. Humanity folded into itself, fracturing into shards of its former unity. The galaxy spun on, indifferent. The other powers take their share. Though the Tyranids loomed largest, they were not alone in sensing opportunity. Among the orcs, a great green seismic shift rippled through the psychic fungus mind of the species. Terra's fall was like a drumming pulse of possibility, a call to battle unlike any other. War bosses swelled in size, fueled by the gestalt excitement of a galaxy teetering on the brink. Soon, WARHAMMER of unprecedented scale erupted across the stars. They followed the light of destruction the Tyranids left behind, like vultures trailing a wildfire. In the hidden depths of tomb complexes, Necron overlords convened in silent councils. Their calculations were swift, merciless, and correct. Humanity had entered its death spiral. With no singular throne, no unified command, and no psychic flame to anchor its fractured empire, the flesh race would collapse within millennia, perhaps centuries. The Necrons did not rejoice. They simply advanced their timetables. The galaxy was ready for reclamation. And on the daemon worlds, the four gods sang. Khorne exulted in the bloodshed. Nurgle welcomed the rot of collapsing civilizations. Slaanesh savored every scream of despair echoing across a now unbounded warp. Tzeentch delighted in the shifting futures that sprouted like 1,000 new branching timelines. Chaos did not conquer terror. It didn't have to. The Tyranids had done the work for them by unmaking the one thing chaos had never managed to kill: imperial certainty, what remains of humanity. And yet, humanity was not gone. Not entirely. In fortress hives, bastion worlds, void citadels, and star-faring enclaves scattered across the dying light of the Astronomicon, humans clung to survival with a stubbornness that had defined them since ancient terror first forged crude tools of war. They fought. They hid. They adapted. They prayed to a throne that no longer answered, hoping the silence was temporary. Entire systems attempted to rebuild local versions of the Imperium, tiny reflections of a dead empire, like shards of a shattered mirror believing themselves whole. Some sectors united under renegade Space Marine chapters who refused to acknowledge Terra's death. Others kneeled to newly risen warlords, whose power came not from right, but from proximity. In the shadows of the galaxy's collapsing order, rogue traders became kings. Penal legions became nations. Scholars became prophets. Mutants became soldiers. And psykers no longer drowned by Terra's psychic gravity burned brighter and more dangerously than ever before. Humanity had become exactly what the galaxy had always wanted it to be, a species struggling for relevance in a story it no longer wrote. The last truth. As the hive mind extended its consciousness across the stars, examining this galaxy it had only begun to consume, it perceived a truth so simple it did not require words. The galaxy belongs to the hungry, not to empires, not to gods, not to ideologies forged in marble and gold, but to whatever force can devour, adapt, endure. Terror had been a monument. Now it was a memory. And memories are not meals. The hive mind pulsed once, a psychic heartbeat felt across 1,000,000 worlds, and the Tyranid fleets shifted course. Their tendrils stretched toward new constellations, new prey, new biomass. Above the hollowed remains of the throne world, the last of Terra's dust drifted upward, pulled gently into the digestive funnels of passing hive creatures. Not even ashes remained. Not even ruins. Just absence. and in that absence, the galaxy turned its page. The Imperium had been a chapter, a long, brutal chapter, but a chapter nonetheless. The next chapter would not be written in ink. It would be written in consumption. And so, in the darkness between dying stars, a single truth rang eternal. The galaxy does not belong to those who claim it. It belongs to those who can eat it.